Great.
Well, everyone, welcome back to a very exciting episode of the Storybox podcast. Today, my friends, I'm delighted to welcome Sarah Fay to the Storybox. Now, for those of you that don't know who she is, she writes for many publications, including the New York Times, the Atlantic, Time, and the Paris Review. So just all the big ones out there. You know, why not? Don't go small, go big. She is a recipient of Hopwood Award for Literature and grants and fellowship of Yaddo, I believe, the Mellon Foundation and the MacDowell Colony, among many others. She has a brand new book out called Pathological, the true story of 6 misdiagnoses as well. Almost 1 in 5 people, that's 47.1 million people in just the US alone, are being diagnosed with a mental health condition. In Australia, I think it is, that number is really, really high, and it's increasingly so over the coming months and years, which is really, really sad. But the book really dives into that, I believe, and shares. It's part memoir and part stories from other people's experiences too about misdiagnoses and what's happened as a result of that. Sarah, can I welcome you so much to the Storybox podcast today?
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you here. Thank you so much for making the time to be here. You have a Ph.D. And may I ask, what's that Ph.D. in? Is it psychology?
English literature.
English literature.
Yeah. And people ask me if they can use the PhD if they want, or if I want to be called doctor. And I'm like, no, I the most I can do is help someone read a book. You know, I mean, I'm not a helpful doctor. I'm just, I'm not the person on the plane who can answer to, is there a doctor on the flight? So
that is interesting. I haven't had many people that have a PhD in literature. That is so cool. How long did it take you to get that PhD?
6 years.
6 years of long study. So a lot of books. Is that correct?
A lot of books and a lot of time spent in what we call the stacks. So meaning the library, we call it the stacks. And so this was back when you actually were dealing with real books and not on the internet. But I joke that I missed the entire Obama presidency because I was completely absorbed. I was just in a tunnel of PhD.
The 8 years of just studying in the library. Because he did
pretty much
2 terms, I believe. How do I know that? Anyway, but it's so good to have you here. I mean, my understanding of the English language is very limited, so I kind of feel like I'm below my britches right now. I'm just kidding. But my very first question for you, and once again, you've listened to my show, so you kind of know the very first question that is coming. So you've kind of had time to prepare for this, I believe. But what does success look like for you?
Right now, and I'm actually writing the sequel to Pathological at the moment. So I'll have the second book coming very soon. But for me, success is that I've healed from a mental illness. I know we're told that you can't, but there is no scientific data that says that we can't fully heal, meaning completely recovered, meaning I no longer have a mental illness. And that's really the greatest success of my life, because I wouldn't be alive today. Long enough ago, but I was in crisis and suicidal and unable to live independently for 5 years. I lived with my mother. This was in my 40s. So I know what serious mental illness is, and not having that anymore I can't even explain it. It's an incredible experience.
How did you end up with that mental health condition?
So I was diagnosed with received my first mental health diagnosis when I was 13. I was in 8th grade, and my parents were divorcing. I was going to a new high school. I was extremely sad, and I was terrified, and I had a terrible stomach ache, and I didn't want to eat. I couldn't eat. I mean, it wasn't even a choice. And I ended up going on an 8th grade class trip, and I didn't eat for 4 days and then couldn't hold down food or water. And my parents rightly took me to the emergency room, and we ended up seeing my pediatrician, and he put me on the scale and he said, "You have anorexia."
Wow.
And at that moment, there was so much going on in my life. I did not have the three classic signs of anorexia. I was not counting calories. I was not obsessively weighing myself. And I didn't think I was fat. I didn't have body dysmorphia at that time. So it really was a doctor, especially a pediatrician, which really, pediatricians in the US, they aren't trained the way that a psychiatrist is, and certainly a child psychiatrist. But for him to look at me and say anorexia, what it did to my child mind, because I wasn't mature enough to handle a diagnosis really, I thought, okay, emotions, thoughts, behaviors, diagnosis, distressing, uncomfortable, anything you don't like, it was because I have a disorder. And then when I was in my 20s, I was told that I had a generalized anxiety disorder, then major depressive disorder. In my 30s, I was told I had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, then obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. Then I was told I had OCD and ADHD with anxious and depressive elements, like a whole mix there. And then I was told in my 40s that I had bipolar disorder. So those were the 6 that I went through. And you asked why I received those diagnoses. I mean, one thing I want to be clear about is mental illness is very, very real. And I had one for 25 years. And it was such a struggle, and it's so clear that I once had a mental illness because I no longer do. My brain is completely different. And I'm trying to explain it in the new book. So I'll hopefully have more when that comes out. But the diagnoses that I received never quite captured my pain. Yeah. And they didn't hold the answers to my pain. So I would get a diagnosis and I would think, yes, this is it. This is the answer. If I just learn everything about ADHD, it's all going to be better and I'm not going to be in this pain. If I just learn everything about major depressive disorder, and I mean everything like how to treat it. But what I didn't know was where our mental health diagnoses come from. I knew nothing about their history, what makes someone get a diagnosis of major depressive disorder. Those things I didn't know yet. So what caused me to get the diagnoses was seeing usually my GP. So in the US, that's like your primary care physician, general doctor, the person you see on an annual visit. Yeah. So my book is not at all anti-psychiatry, because most of my diagnoses came from an annual visit to my doctor. After 15 minutes, he would say, you have ADHD. And then another said, no, generalized anxiety disorder. So these diagnoses were being given very freely and not by the experts.
When we say, okay, so you're diagnosed with a mental health condition, did you find that the diagnosis actually helped you work on the path towards recovery, or did you think it made it worse?
I know that it made me worse. And again, I didn't want to say, because I think everyone has a different experience of this, but it made me worse because I over-identified with the diagnosis. Yeah. I saw myself as the diagnosis. Well, even going back
identity,
to,
doesn't it?
It absolutely. And that's the danger. Now, some people find great relief in their diagnoses, and I think they see them in a more positive light than I did. And then there's one example of autism, where that community, they just rally around their diagnosis. They are empowered by their diagnosis. They get funding, they get resources. That's a very positive, and again, I'm generalizing, but positive diagnosis. I took on all the negatives. And so I didn't get well. And then part of it was that I was told that I would have them for the rest of my life and that I would never heal. So like, where does that leave you exactly?
Yeah, it doesn't leave you with many options, does it? Like you can continue going back to the doctor and just like what's the point? If you're not going to heal ever, then what's the point of going to the doctor? Honestly, yeah. It doesn't make any sense to me, to be honest.
And that's just bringing on so much despair. We think about, when I think about my experience with suicidality, it was so much of it had to do with the fact that I thought, I'm always going to be this way. I'm always going to be in this pain. And one reason why I wrote Pathological and why I'm writing the new book is to try to save people from feeling that way. Yeah. There is hope and there is a chance, and I've experienced it, and it's absolutely worth hanging on.
When you are in that stage of depression, of anxiety, of suicidal ideation, you don't feel like there is any hope. You don't feel like there is a way out at all because you're so focused in that negative state, if I can use the word negative, that everything else is meaningless. And I know I've been there. Like when I was growing up, like I would be in and out of hospital with stomach problems. Doctors had no idea what was going on with me. And I equate most of that to, because unexplained illness, I equate most of that to trauma. And back then we had no idea, especially my parents, they had no idea about traumas, about how that affects the body, about how that affects the mental health. And as a result, like neither did the doctors. Like they didn't say, hey, we're going to diagnose you with a traumatic problem here. Like let's work on some strategies and how to heal that. I'm only learning that now at the age of 25, 20, almost 26, which is fascinating. And like backtracking to my younger self, I'm like, that makes a lot of sense. Like, because there's a lot of unexplained illnesses that go on and they slip through the radar, slip through the cracks. They get misdiagnosed or they don't even get diagnosed. And as a result, it's like you're left questioning what's going on. But there's overwhelming evidence now to suggest that, okay, what happened with me in and out of hospital with stomach problems and all that sort of stuff was linked to sexual abuse as a 6-year-old kid. And that just, it interests me. But then also later on in my life, dealing with depression, it's like you have this cloud over you, this brain fog that goes on. You can't really explain it until it's made clear to you. And that was only made clear to me in 2020 when we finally found out there was sexual abuse. So there's that. And then also dealing with severe panic attacks, anxiety for most of my life, which came as a result, I believe, like you were talking about, things going on in the family, a lot of pressure, then depression. And then I also dealt with anorexia, bulimia, and addictions. So I completely resonate and I understand what it's like. And I went through all that like in my teens and my early 20s. And I wish I had a book like yours and to just tell me like this is what's going on and here's how to help. Like here's how to heal completely. It's possible.
Yeah. And with pathological, the first step for me, because I over-identified, and this isn't everyone's experience. So pathological is the first step of this, which was I had to find out that the labels were given, although I don't love that term because it's somewhat dismissive. And I think, psychiatric diagnosis, we mean well when we use them. We're trying to categorize, we're trying to treat, again, it's meant well. But when we were given a label, those labels are really flimsy. They're not based in science and they don't have the research to back them up. So if you're using the diagnosis for yourself to help yourself, absolutely go for it. Like that's great. But if you are like I did, if you're using it against yourself, they aren't strong enough. They aren't valid enough to do that. They do not mean that there is something wrong with you or there is something biologically broken in you. None of those diagnoses do.
So what if someone is misdiagnosed? How do we help them?
What's interesting, the reason why I chose the word misdiagnosis is because, I'm an English professor. I geek out on definitions. Actually, a review, it was a negative review of my book. I got lots of nice reviews and the New York Times was very nice and very, hailed it as a fiery manifesto of a memoir. But I did get a bad review. And she said, she defines everything. And I was like, yeah, I do. 100%.
What's wrong with that?
But anyway, so misdiagnosis, I think of it as being incorrect, but it's actually incorrect or inadequate.
Yeah.
And so there's a part of that I felt like was kind of empowering, which is that we get a mental health diagnosis. We think I thought they were scientifically proven, totally valid. If someone says you have major depressive disorder, you have major depressive disorder, and there's no conversation to be had about it. And what I learned in my research is that that's not the case. we need to have that conversation with our mental health care provider, whoever is or clinician, whoever's doing the diagnosing, and talk about, is this an accurate, adequate, correct diagnosis, right? Does it fit all these, tick all these boxes in a way? Because really what I found is that mental health diagnoses come from a book. It's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. If your eyes just glazed over, don't worry. Mine did too every time I heard that title for some reason. But it's known as the DSM. We use it in the United States, but it has a huge influence globally. So even though I think Australia uses the ICD, which is the World Health Organization's kind of version, it's not their version, but it's their companion to the DSM. The DSM, all the diagnoses that we have in there are very much a part of popular culture. I mean, they're just very much, they're everywhere, right? Major depressive disorder, ADHD, OCD. They're in our conversations. They're in our minds. We self-diagnose. There are TikTok therapists. Diagnoses are memes. I mean, they're just everywhere. And so I pictured, a research lab with people in lab coats, microscopes, petri dishes, that's where those diagnoses came from. And it turns out they actually are just theories in a book. And in 1952, members of the American Psychiatric Association sat down around a table and determined these are 128 thoughts, behaviors, or emotions that we're going to call pathological, meaning not normal, and that there's something wrong with them if you experience them in this way. And that's it. That's as far as it goes. So there is research about the diagnoses, but the diagnoses don't come from research, if that makes sense. And I had no idea. And then there's the reliability factor, which is that if you see two clinicians at the same time and I tell my story of not eating, of my parents divorcing, et cetera, they likely will not agree on the diagnosis using the criteria from the DSM. So all of that was incredibly disturbing to me, especially because I had over-identified so much and really I centered my life around my diagnosis. I made it my identity. I didn't have bipolar disorder. I was bipolar. It was me. And that was really, really dangerous. So a misdiagnosis in that way, you say, what can someone do? I actually started a movement, a public awareness campaign for this reason. My book tells my story, and then it also, Pathological, this book, it tells my story, but it also gives people all the information I wish I'd known about mental health diagnoses. So that's kind of where to start if you really want to help yourself or help your child to know what you're dealing with when you walk into a clinician's office and they say to you, you have bipolar disorder, you have anxiety disorder. But then I also, since the book came out, I wanted to give people action steps. And so I founded Pathological, the movement, which is a public awareness campaign to empower people to make more informed decisions about their mental health. And I have an amazing advisory board. I'm not a mental health professional, of mental health professionals who kind of have checked everything that I say. I'm very confident in my research abilities and my writing abilities, but they know best. But the Pathological, the movement wants to give people 4 facts. And this is, again, to empower you in making mental health decisions. The first fact is that a mental health diagnosis is just a designation that a clinician uses to get you the right treatment. Yeah. It's not an identity. It's not you. It's just a designation. And what's fascinating is in my research, between the 19th century and most of the way through the 20th century, patients didn't know their diagnoses. They had no idea. They were just for doctors to communicate with each other, not for doctors to communicate with patients, and certainly not for patients to think about themselves. The second fact we give people is that it's best always with a psychiatric diagnosis to get a second opinion. And I know that's a luxury. I've been without healthcare. I don't know if it is in Australia because you're all more evolved than we are. But, not having healthcare, I know that getting a second opinion can be a luxury, but it's really important to check a diagnosis because they are invalid. We do not have a biological marker, an objective measure like an X-ray or a scan or some sort of blood test to prove it. So getting a second opinion. The third fact is that the chemical imbalance theory, which is now called the chemical imbalance myth, is just that. It's scientifically meaningless. You do not have a chemical imbalance. That's not to say that the brain isn't involved. It's just that theory that you have levels of serotonin that are too low or dopamine or whatever it might be. That was never came to fruition. That was never valid. And then the fourth fact, which is the most important to me, is that no mental health diagnosis has been proven to be lifelong and we can recover. Yeah. So those are the four facts. So I would follow those if I received a diagnosis and if I wanted to make sure that I didn't get one that's incorrect, inaccurate, or inadequate.
4 important points to definitely touch on further. And I know that with the chemical imbalances and that sort of thing, I know what happens when we don't sleep. There is evidence to suggest that our hormones are out of whack and we don't feel the best. Like, it does affect our mood, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we are depressed. But if we are long-term not sleeping effectively, properly, that can throw us completely out of alignment. But as our good friend Johan Hari says in Lost Connections, that has a major contributing factor to our mental health. Like, not having proper connections in our lives can contribute to mental health problems like anxiety, like depression, like feeling lonely. And I know that for me, that is definitely the case. So I mix sleep with connections. Those are 2 extra ones that I thought I'd share in the mix, and hopefully you might agree with me on that with the research that you've done. And yeah.
If you could see me, I'm nodding my head majorly because I completely agree. I mean, sleep is primary. There's just no way around that. And, to maintain my health, I don't see it that way, but the way that I healed was I go to bed at the same time every night and I wake up at the same time every morning like a child, like a child. And that is key. And so, but so absolutely that's true. And social connection too. I don't know if you have this in Australia, but the other aspect of social connection that I think is important, and it's something I talk about in my book, is also accepting or deciding what kind of social connection is important to you. Yeah. Because we have this, like, you have to have tons of friends or you have to, and it's too much. I'm a very solitary person. I love solitude. And so what I did when I was healing was I decided, okay, I can only have 3 areas of focus in my life. That's it. I get to pick 3. They can be whatever I want. And I chose writing, teaching, and my family. I'm not a good friend. I will just say it right now. Like, it's just not my area of focus right now. And that might change, but I want to also accept myself that that's where I'm finding connection. And it doesn't have to look like all the websites that tell us you have to have a group of friends and you have to have this and you have to have that and be on Instagram and Facebook and, whatever it might be, that we also acknowledge what social connection is to us. Yep. And feel validated. Like, that's enough for me, kind of.
I'm very much like you. I'm introverted. I much prefer to stay home, read a good book, watch a movie, but I also enjoy those moments of, speaking with a good friend. It doesn't mean I have to have like 1,000,001 friends, because that would be almost impossible to keep up with everyone every single day. And that'd be so tiring. I don't know how young people do it these days, but I guess they just have that extra amount of energy about their day, because it does feel amazing. And I think that's the kind of connection that we need to have more of, like proper connection. I think social media and that is a small part of connection. I think it's more wired than anything else rather than a proper connection. It just enables us to be able to meet someone so we can connect with them properly. But yeah, I think being able to sit down with someone like face to face and really connect on deeper, more meaningful topics of conversation, that helps spark something within us. It changes our hormones. I've noticed that you get a lot more serotonin, you get a lot more happiness drugs that are natural in your system, which also plays on how we end up sleeping that night. Also, exercise is a fantastic element. Waking up really, really early, getting some sun, those things. So I thought I'd throw those into the mix as well.
Absolutely. And I just want to go back a little to the social connection again, because I'm an iconoclast when it comes to this. This is where I'm a rebel, but I get a lot of satisfaction from online connections. I don't know why. I teach online actually at the university and I love it. Like I feel totally the same online as I do in the classroom. And I don't think that's generally how people feel, but I think we also kind of condemn online connections as necessarily being bad. But I don't know that there's evidence to support that. And people, especially with social anxiety, and I don't mean a disorder, but I do get anxious about, I would be very happy being here with my cat at all times, shooting video of him, and posting it, but so when I go out, there's a little bit of a stress element. And so I don't always feel as connected as I think other people do when they're face to face. So I just think there's more to open to in the sense of social connection can look a lot of different ways for a lot of different people.
Yeah, I appreciate you actually saying that because that is very true. And also like with social media, I think the main point of concern, this is for me at least, that I've noticed is people not actually responding to you. So you'll send them a message, whereas in actual person, like you can see their emotions, you can see how they're acting, whereas if it's a text message and it's kind of like it's a bit different. But I think over Zoom and all that sort of stuff, there is a level of connection there. I definitely agree with that because we're doing it right now.
Yeah.
So you can feel it. You can feel it through the Zoom, which is fantastic. And I think technology has allowed that for us. But the majority of people, they don't get that. I think they solely rely on texting as their form of daily connection in a way. So, but yeah. Anyway, that's another topic of conversation. But I wanted to ask you, Sarah, going back to your story a little bit, when was your lowest moment? Do you remember?
So I had been living with my mother for 5 years. As I mentioned, I was in my 40s. I was in crisis and was suicidal at the time. And I had a falling out with my psychiatrist. It's in the book. His name is Dr. M. He's not evil, but he's the villain. And really there was, again, I think psychiatry has a very difficult job to do. We go to them with our psychic and emotional pain and say, help me. And meanwhile, they're trying to understand the brain and its 10 billion neurons or whatever it might be, and then understand the mind. What is the mind? We don't even know. So I think they have a really tall order. And there are some bad apples, but my feeling is mental health professionals across the board want to help. That's why they are in the field that they are. And I really admire them and respect that. Occasionally you get those that suffer from hubris and really are just so arrogant that they lose sight of the patient. And that's what Dr. M was for me. So I had said I wanted to stop seeing him. And he said no. And then I said, well, I'm going to. And I was out of medication and he refused to refill them. So I'm out of medication. I'm suicidal. I'm in crisis. And I'm, living at my mother's. My sister swept in. My family is definitely the hero of my book. I think families, especially if they're touched by mental illness, don't get the credit that they deserve. They struggle so much. They have it so hard, and they really are the heroes of those stories. But my sister swept in, found me a psychiatrist. I went to see him, and we had the 27-minute consultation, and I waited at the end for him to say to me to declare either a new diagnosis, a 7th, or to give me, reify, yes, you have bipolar disorder. And instead he looked at me and he said, I don't know what you have. And my whole world changed. I thought, no one knows what I have actually. And that was both my lowest point and my turning point, because what happened was I left his office. We were talking about Chicago weather, but it was a polar vortex. I mean, polar vortex. Like it was so brutally cold. And I left his office and I was walking down Chicago Avenue, and just the world, Michigan Avenue, just the people, the trees, the cabs all looked crisper, harsher, but clearer. It was like, oh, I understand now. The answer wasn't in the diagnosis. The answer is somewhere else. It's a combination of treatment and response and helping yourself and getting help. I mean, it's this complex array of things. But that's when I started to research and when I decided I'm going to learn everything about mental health diagnoses. And that's when I started writing Pathological.
Did you find that the medication you were on actually helped you in your mental health condition?
I had a really different experience with medication than a lot of people do, in that I was diagnosed very young, 13, with anorexia, but they weren't treating anorexics or people diagnosed with anorexia with SSRIs at that time. So I did not get my first psychotropic medication until I was in my 30s. And that's very late. But I was in the system that whole time. So that's very different. Once I was prescribed an SSRI, then I was in the cycle, and I was very quickly, dosages were changed, meds were changed. I was on and off and on lithium and antipsychotics and all, the whole thing. But there's no question that medication has helped me tremendously. And I think that there's a lot of pill shaming that goes on. There's this idea that somehow you have to be psychopharmacologically pure, and a lot of us are very much helped by our medications. And as long as we don't know very much about mental illness and mental health diagnoses are somewhat insufficient, whatever helps you, like, more power to you, whether it's meditation or medication. One isn't better or worse. I'm going to get funding from the pharmaceutical companies for saying this, but yeah, I just think, yes, in my experience, it was very helpful. The only downside of it was that no one told me that if you stay on them for 12 years, you probably aren't going to be able to go off them. Yeah. And that I would have liked to have known. I'm not sure I would have done anything any differently. I was in incredible pain and I wanted relief, and they did bring that, but now I'm still on them simply because I think my body's dependent on them.
Yeah, I know that mental health medication is a big topic for a lot of people. And while I was never on them, I do know a lot of people that if they weren't on them, they probably wouldn't be alive today. But the problem is subscribing, usually the first instance for a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists is to prescribe SSRIs and medication to people once they have given them a diagnosis. Say, here you have a mental illness, but there also needs to be other tools. You can't just solely rely on medication to clear your mental illness. I think that these days, there's more research doing around other areas that you can use to help, like meditation. And I think all of them, all things considered, if you can get off medication, that is probably better for your system as a whole, because you do end up relying heavily on the medication. It does break the bank half the time. And also, you become addicted to the stuff, which is another entire element altogether, which you can go down. And I think as well, for psychologists, I know I'm not a psychologist or anything like that, but if someone is struggling with an addiction, it's probably not a good idea as your first instance to prescribe a drug that is addictive in the long term. That's just going to make their mental health 10 times more worse. It may help one area, but what about the other area too? You know what I mean? It's so much to it.
There is. So what you're talking about too is benzodiazepines, right? Which we prescribe for anxiety, which are highly addictive. SSRIs aren't, which is why they're not street drugs. They don't really give a high to anybody, but amphetamines used to treat ADHD medications obviously are, which is why in the United States you need, I think they're a class anyway, they're considered a narcotic. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's also interesting and why I wanted to tell my story is that I also tried everything before I went on medication. I tried meditation. I mean, I went to Plum Village with Thich Nhat Hanh. I mean, I was like, I felt my inner body with Eckhart Tolle. I mindfully washed my hands, like more than I can say. And I also, I mean, Chinese herbs and yoga, and I always have eaten very healthy. And so I really did try everything. And sometimes, just they don't work. Yeah. And you do need a medication or something that can help and stabilize and get you through. And I think if you continue to be on them, that's just a personal decision and a personal choice. But I'd like to see like the end goal. I'd like to see the end goal change and the starting point change. And what I mean by that is that what we do is we kind of criticize medications, but the starting point is diagnosis.
Yeah.
So if we're just readily accepting a diagnosis, of course, we're going to go straight to medication. But if we have a conversation about the diagnosis, then we have to have a conversation about the medication too. Mm-hmm. And so that might, again, empower patients a little bit more. And then I don't know that the end goal needs to be on medication, off medication, but I do think we should always be given an exit strategy. And what that means is that, yes, I am going to, we don't know, my kind of ideal conversation between a mental health professional and a patient or a clinician is, okay, we don't know very much about mental illness. We do not know very much about mental health diagnoses. The mental health diagnoses we have are incredibly flawed, but these are the ones we use. I think you have X diagnosis, major depressive disorder. We're going to use that just as a label, as a way to get you the treatment you need. The treatment I think you should have is an SSRI based on that. What are your thoughts? Like, that's the ideal conversation, which I never had. I was told, you have bipolar disorder. Here's your lithium. Like, and then, or whatever medication it would have been. So
I've heard some pretty wild stories with people that were on lithium and what that did to their entire system. Like it was pretty nasty. I don't know if you've heard any of those in your research.
I don't want to.
Trust me, you don't.
No, I don't. I was
pretty crazy.
The internet people asked me, what would you say to your younger self? And it was, don't read the internet. Don't read ever, unless it's a scientific journal. Don't read it.
That's probably wise advice, actually. But I do understand, look, doctors are humans too at the end of the day. And while they're seeing many, many patients on any given day, they're bound to get some diagnosis wrong. And I think there's got to be a level of empathy towards that too, because you can't get everything right. That's impossible. But I think also helping those doctors with strategies around, okay, actually taking the time to listen to this patient properly before actually going in full ball and making a diagnosis that could be wrong. Like that's where it needs to start as well, as you were saying, which I think is, it's needed. And you were saying to me before we officially began recording that Australia is really much on the forefront of this, which is fantastic to hear. I didn't know that. So I'm like cheering Australia on. But the rate of mental health and the increase of it, like why is that happening today, especially? What's going on with that?
Well, there's, I just want to mention, that I feel like every time I hear, a brilliant mental health professional talking about diagnoses and their limitations, they're Australian. So there's just no question, Bruce Cohen and others. But I just want to promote Lucy Fox. I don't know if I'm saying her name right, but her last name is Foulkes, and she's British, and she has a book out called Losing Our Minds. It is phenomenal. But I say that because you should have her on the show. She's really it's a phenomenal book. But one, she's such a wonderful researcher. She's so clear. Has a Ph.D. in psychology, but is an academic psychologist. So she's not a clinician. But what she does in her book is talk about what you just asked, which is our mental health getting worse or not? how do we look at these studies? And what she does so brilliantly and beautifully is she backtracks and she says, which we don't talk about, who's determining in these surveys, how are we determining bad mental health, poor mental health, good mental health? And she talks about how we use interviews, which can be reliable, but also surveys, which are incredibly unreliable and often very leading. So have you felt down or depressed in the last 2 weeks? I will say yes, like to every question, just because, like, of course I can find a time, or whatever it might be. But she does a really good job of parsing the studies that have come out and looking at the effects of the pandemic, and whether or not our mental health is actually deteriorating globally or in individual countries or not.
Yeah. And
she just brings it under, sort of scrutiny that we are saying, oh, our mental health. And she says, it's not that straightforward.
Yeah. I think it's a much bigger and wider sort of question to be asked, I think. Because, I've noticed during the pandemic, especially, the numbers have since increased. Like, there's been a lot more people calling, like, the health lines in saying that, it's like, how do we help those people? What do we need to do? Is enough being done? Like, so many of those questions I'm asking as well. Like, if you got the increase happening, is the increase of help happening at the same time? Like, how can we coincide with that? So that's the way I think about it, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, and that's certainly not happening in the United States on some level. And I think this also gets into the question of whose mental health has deteriorated because of the pandemic. When we just say everyone, well, Lucy Fox makes a great case, and others have too, that it was people hit hardest by the pandemic. So it was those in low income areas. It was those from marginalized communities. And certainly there were other traumas that have happened over the past few years, certainly in the United States with George Floyd. And I mean, Black Lives Matter has been going on long before that. But so there's all these other dimensions that when we just say our mental health is getting worse or something along those lines, it allows us to skip over the particulars that we have to face. And that points to what you just said about, are we helping? Isn't always just going to be with a crisis line or, access to care, although those are really important. It's also, what are we doing about socioeconomic inequality? Yeah. What are we doing about crime? What do we do? They're all related. And so, it's a great point. And we just had 988 is a new number it was supposed to be more like a suicide hotline, but they're billing it as all mental health conditions. And they just know that we don't have the manpower to really make it work. So you set up this thing in theory, and we don't know how it's going to go.
And there's only really so much you can do if someone calls you over the phone. Like, imagine how many people are actually calling that number every single day. And then the person on the one answering the phone, can you imagine how they must be feeling? Like, they're trying to help someone over the phone rather than in person. So there's got to be like that level of, okay, there's got to be something more that we can do here rather than, that's all good and well, but there needs to be other areas, like you mentioned, the socioeconomic issues, crime. I wanted to steer the conversation more towards asking you about what was the most difficult part for you in terms of writing your new book?
It's interesting. I wrote it very quickly. Now, granted, I'm a writer, so that was, I'd spent years on novels that went nowhere. But I've been writing my whole life, and I wrote it in about 5 months, which is extremely quickly, especially given, and the research took longer. But so the writing actually, I don't want to say it was easy, but I did something kind of different than often happens, which is that I didn't show anyone the book, but I did I have an ex-boyfriend who's actually in the book. His name is Ray. He's in the book, and he does construction, and his work is incredibly hard on his body. You know, he's the one jackhammering all day long. So he can't read. And when he comes home, he just is deflated, but he does listen to audiobooks all the time. So what I did is I would write a chapter and then I would record myself reading it and I would send it to him. And he would listen, and all he would say was, "It's fantastic. Keep going." And I was like, excellent. That's what you want in a writing partner. Like, that is all you want in an editor. And so I did. I just was going so quickly. So that was really a very fulfilling experience, and not so much hard. What's kind of odd is the hardest chapter to write is about, I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder after my cat of 16 years had died. Now, that sounds ridiculous to people who don't have cats, but cat people out there will understand. But I was incredibly sad. I mean, I was bereft and I was grieving for a long time. But according to the DSM, you know, it's a longer story in terms of how grief has been dealt with in the DSM. But basically, if you make an exclusion for grief and you can say, no, this person has grief and doesn't deserve a diagnosis of major depressive disorder, well, then you have to start making, exclusions for other things too. So that's been a real sticking point for the authors of the DSM, because it calls into question major depression as a diagnosis. You can't suddenly have all these exclusions. That makes it look like a weak diagnosis, a kind of flimsy one. And now they've actually pulled it out. There is no bereavement exclusion. So you cannot, if your father has just died and you grieve for longer than a year, you have major depressive disorder, or you have prolonged grief disorder is what it's called now. So anyway, there I was, living in New York. It was very difficult. I had no money and my cat had just passed away. And I went to a psychologist. The psychologist said, "You have major depressive disorder." But writing the part of the book where my cat died was the hardest part. I mean, here I'm writing about when I've been suicidal, and it's not as hard as the cat. Yeah. That was just ridiculous. And it's funny, but readers constantly tell me they cried at that part. So
I know what you mean. I'm not a cat person. I'm a dog person.
Same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. But I know the feeling of losing an animal, and only if you've been through that will you fully understand the extent of what we're actually talking about. I remember writing, so I've lost 2 German Shepherds. So one of them, our first one, Missy, when I was 8 years old, I believe, 8 or 9. And writing about her was hard. And then recently in 2019, we lost our German Shepherd of 11 years, Joy. And that every time I reread it and every time I go over it, it just breaks my heart. I end up bawling my eyes out as a result. Or whenever I listen to a song, there's one, Happier by Bastille and Marshmello. I don't know if you've heard the song.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
But it just makes me cry. I did the worst possible thing, and I watched the music video a day after the loss of Joy. Oh my goodness, I was a mess. I was a mess. But anyway, I understand that challenge of writing about someone you've lost. It is, it's crazy and heartbreaking at the same time. But
yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Where can people get a copy of your new book for those people that are in the US, Australia? Do you want to go to Amazon first? Bookstores? Yeah. Where do you want?
Amazon or local bookstores. It's available everywhere. You can also contact HarperCollins or Harper One, which is the publisher. And you can also contact me. So on socials, I'm at Sarah Fay Author. So it's SARAHFAY Author on all social media platforms.
I'll make sure everyone knows where to get a copy of the book, connect with you, all those wonderful things. Sarah, my final question for you, if you've gotten to the end of my conversations on my other podcast and you'll have already prepared for this one, hopefully, maybe I'm overreaching. This is a hypothetical question. I want you to imagine with me for a moment that you've been able to reach the age of 100. all your friends and your family have decided to put together a film for you of everything you've ever said and everything you've ever done. Don't ask me how in the world they've got it all. We call it magic for the sake of argument, but they've been able to get it and show it to you on your 100th birthday. What do you want that film to say and to show about your life?
That I helped people, that this book, my writing, Pathological, the movement, I'm a speaker, and that I saved people's lives. I helped people in their lives. And really, I would love for that footage to be me, again, speaking to people, helping people, reaching them. That would be the main thing. And then also being with my cat and my family and my students.
I love it. Thank you so much for your time today, your wisdom, your advice, your stories, and your grace as well with that other part for joining me today on the Storybox podcast. It's been a blessing.
Thank you so much.